And National Party leader Christopher Luxon is with me. Good morning to you.
Morning, Chris. Great to be with you.
Nice to see you. Let's cover off how thousands of health workers up and down New Zealand on strike again today over pay and working conditions. Should they get more money?
Well, look, I think the bigger question on healthcare is why are we spending $500 million restructuring healthcare, which is just rearranging chairs and bureaucracy, to be honest. And all the money's going into middle management, that $500 million. All of that money's gone into management consultants and firms that are helping with restructuring. And you're right, that's the sort of money that should be going to the frontline and to the frontline workers. And so, that's where we'd sooner see the money go to frontline services, to making sure we've got enough workers. The big problem we've got in healthcare is, and I am very concerned about it, is that it's a very stressed and overwhelmed system, despite what the government's trying to say. When you talk to people who are inside the system, it's pretty tough. And we're 4,000 nurses short. You would have seen it actually just, even with this immigration setting, there's no midwives, nurses, teachers being allowed to come in with a pathway to residency, yet we desperately need them. And the problem is that they're going to leave the New Zealand system and probably go to Australia at some point. So the bigger point for me is stop spending the money on middle management and building bureaucracy in Wellington and get it to the frontline services.
I want to pick you up on that because the government has indeed left off the likes of nurses and midwives from its so-called green list for a pathway to residency. Now, the immigration minister has said, well, that's because if you give them residency too fast, they will go elsewhere. Is that the kind of argument that is warranted? I thought at the end of the day, if we've got a skills shortage of nurses and midwives, bring them in, let them stay.
We've got a major shortage, mate, of nurses, in particular doctors as well. But what was really odd about that announcement was it did exclude nurses, teachers, and also midwives. And we are in desperate need of those skills here in New Zealand. It's what's needed for our society. It's what's needed for our economy. And so there's ways that you can handle that, I suspect, with bonding and other things that you could explore. But the bottom line is we need those people here, because for every nurse we bring into New Zealand, we lose one out to somewhere else. They go off somewhere else overseas. And so, I don't understand why we haven't done that. Australia's put them on the priority skills list. Why, if you were sitting in Wales or Scotland as a nurse, would you consider coming to New Zealand when Australia is actually offering the certainty of immediate residency? And so the challenge here, Chris, as you and I've said before, is that if you want the best and there is a global war for talent, then you have to be the best as an immigration service. And we just frankly aren't. I mean, the Canadians, the Australians are doing a much more aggressive and better job, frankly, of attracting the skills that they need to power up their economy, who they happen to be the same people we need.
I want to move on to New Zealand On Air now, has given a production company $220,000 taxpayer dollars to make a documentary about current sitting MP Chloe Swarbrick. Chloe's a nice enough person. I quite like Chloe, but is this an appropriate use of taxpayer dollars? I understand the documentary will come out after the election, but does it warrant, a lot of money on a current sitting MP, taxpayer dollars?
Yeah, look, I mean, ultimately that decision's for New Zealand On Air. And to be honest, Chris, I don't know what the criteria for funding actually is, but it just doesn't feel appropriate for taxpayer money to be used to fund a documentary for a sitting MP. And especially when you think, the work will be happening, during an election period or through the election time. It doesn't sort of feel right. I mean, I also agree with you. I think Chloe's, really a good person, but it's not about Chloe. It's actually just about the process of, should that be something that New Zealand On Air should be doing, and is it appropriate for a government-funded money and taxpayer money to be used to fund fund a documentary on a single sitting MP? It just doesn't feel right.
Well, you imagine the outrage if the documentary was going to be about Chris Bishop, for argument's sake. Can you imagine the outrage on Twitter over that?
Yes.
Speaking of outrage and speaking of too much money being spent, I want to pick up on this that was last week's news, but since 2019, NZTA has spent $145 million on consultants covering things like the environment and planning versus just $200 million on actually constructing or making roads. That sounds obscene.
Yeah, look, I mean, it's actually illustrative, to be honest, of what's going on across the whole of government and all the agencies. I could point you to stories in immigration. We've spent 150 million in immigration, 500 more staff, but actually the processing of visas is 7 times slower. So, it's the point that I've been trying to make for a long time is this government gets really obsessed on announcements and spending money, but actually doesn't understand that doesn't necessarily mean you're getting outcomes. But the NZTA piece is quite outrageous. I mean, they've gone from 32 communication staff, I think, to 88. They had 6 of them that were getting $100,000 or more back when they had 32. And now they've got, I think 65, almost 3/4 of people in that communications department of NZTA are now getting over $100,000. And at the same time, each year they bill us 75 million for consultants. That's up over from 31 million. And as you just said, the last 3 years, I think they spent 145 million on consultants, but they've only spent 202 million on actually constructing roads. And again, it gets you back to the point that I'm trying to make, which is this government is centralising everything and building massive bureaucracy here in Wellington. And it thinks that it gets everything done through the bureaucracy. And I tell you, the money has to leave the healthcare system and the bureaucracy, or the transport system, the immigration system, and it actually has to get to the front line to secure the outcomes that we need to see. And they're two different things, right? Spending money and outcomes are two different things.
So if you got into government, would you look at slashing some of the spin doctors that are inside NZTA?
Absolutely. I mean, there's just, the problem is that you end up, creating roles, people come to work, they do things, they do the wrong things, it's not focused on the right stuff, and it's all about outcomes. We need to maintain our roads. That money would have been much better spent, upgrading a road somewhere in this country, making sure that it was safer, making sure that the speed limit could be maintained. But at the moment, you haven't spent money on roads, haven't invested in any new roads over the last 5 years. And now the answer is because our roads haven't been invested in, they're deteriorating, we'll just lower the speed limit from 100 to 80 Ks.
Speaking of roads, I know Auckland's looking at congestion charges. Even Christchurch, a small population of Christchurch, have got some councillors who are kind of, okay, let's consider congestion charges. But that's not really going to save the planet, and I don't think that'll get people out of cars. What do you say?
Yeah, look, I mean, congestion charges work when you've really genuinely got a bigger city. And so I think for Auckland with, almost 2 million people in it, it's sort of kind of is something that should be explored. But there are some really big caveats around that and some big conditions. You cannot make congestion charging a tax grab. It's got to be revenue neutral. In Auckland, we actually have a regional fuel tax, so people pay more for their fuel in Auckland because, in theory, they've raised over 500 million, another $500 million, of which most of it's been unspent. It was supposed to be upgrading roads and investing in public transport where it didn't exist. But, there's some real challenges with congestion charging. I mean, it does work around the world in the large cities to reduce congestion, and the benefit is then that tradie gets to do 4 or 5 jobs a day rather than 2 or 3 because they're not stuck in traffic. And in Auckland, you can spend hours stuck in traffic as a tradie each day. But you've got to be revenue neutral. You'd have to pull back the fuel tax, and you've got to make sure that when people don't have a public transport option, it doesn't end up impacting them and adding cost that drives to the cost of living going forward. So there's a lot in the detail. And again, just a government that I don't trust on delivering detail well. You can have good intentions, but you've got to execute well.
National and ACTS will have enough votes to form the next government if an election was held now, according to a new poll commissioned by the Taxpayers Union. What are your thoughts on that?
Oh, look, I mean, all the polls we've had in the last 5 months since we made the leadership changes have been, really encouraging, and we're making progress is sort of my take of those polls. But the big single thing is just coming back, and I can tell you I've been in Ashburton, I've been in Fielding, I've been all over the country just in the last couple of weeks. Again, I try and get to 2 or 3 towns a week, and everyone's saying the same thing everywhere, which is the cost of living crisis, and they are concerned about poor economic management. And everyone senses that we're going to go through a tougher time, with the economy, and they just sense that this government is all spin, no delivery, really hasn't got a grip on it, still very ideologically driven, centralising everything, coming up with pet projects and wasting money. And so, that's the real sense of those polls that I take away.
Chris Luxon, good to have you back on the program this morning. Take care.
Great to be with you, Chris.